What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. In today's video, I'll be looking at which wide receivers have risen and fallen the most in ADP over the last week. We're finally getting some news from camps, which is amazing. So we'll be able to see how that news is impacting drafts. And believe it or not, drafts are right around the corner. I have one of mine on September 5th. And another one's to be determined, but I expect it to be like that weekend of the 5th and 6th. I think that's what a ton of you guys will end up doing. And that's only 2.5 weeks away. You know, it's kind of crazy how that just sneaks up on us. So make sure you don't wait too long to get ready for that. And if you do want to see some extra information, we have a ton of extra information at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. So check that out if you have not done so already. But guys, we got to start today's video off with the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was which quarterback had the least drop passes last season, least drop passes from their weapons, obviously not them. The answer was Ryan Tannehill, and Dollar Bill DDB was the first to get that one right. Today's stat, the top 3 tight ends in terms of air yards last season were Travis Kelce, Zach Ertz, Mark Andrews, and then who was 4th? And I'll give you a hint. It's not Kittle. That would be too easy. It was not George Kittle. All right, let's see who's moving up and down the most. We're going to go over risers first, and then we'll transition into fallers. But Deebo Samuel is the #1 riser. To me, that's a little bit confusing. When I looked that up, I was like, oh, did I miss a bit of news that was like he's good to go for week 1? Because definitely, you know, his ADP is going to rise if that came out. But that's not what happened. The quote from Shanahan recently was this: Deebo's going to do anything he can to be in shape, but it's hard to be in football shape until you actually play football. So how many practices can we get him in here before Arizona? That's going to all go into play. So I'm hoping for week 1, but not sure yet. And he was also quoted later as saying that he's not necessarily counting on it. So they are preparing for the potential that he's not ready for week 1. To me, this seems like a situation where maybe he's out for like 1 or 2 weeks to start the season, but whenever he does come back, it's going to be slow. You know, he's going to be slowly ramped up. And so this isn't a guy you're going to be able to start in fantasy for at least the first month of the season. That's what it really seems like is going to happen, which honestly isn't like the end of the world because he's not going so early that you need to start him. Like even if you started 3 wide receivers and he was your wide receiver 3, you know, it's not the end of the world that, okay, you just take your 4 and you play him as your 3 for the first month, right? That'd be fine. He is up to the wide receiver 35, which is like that late 7th to early 8th round, but he's my wide receiver 48. So I do have him a lot below ADP. I do have him as in the void. The biggest reason for me is even when he's 100%, what's his role going to be? You know, this isn't a guy where as soon as he comes back to all the snaps, we're like, okay, week in, week out, wide receiver 2. We don't know that. You know, Brandon Ayuk can do a lot of the same things as Deebo can. And so when you consider they also, obviously George Kittle is going to get more targets than Deebo's going to get. Obviously, they have a dominant ground game. They do have Jerick McKinnon coming back, and while we don't know his role, he could take more targets than they were giving to running backs last season. And so it's not like he's just the guy, you know, and when he comes back, he's good to go. And so when you consider that there's also a lot of risk, you know, he definitely is at an increased chance of getting re-injured from this. There's obviously the risk that maybe it's a month and a half, maybe it's 2 months before he's playing, you know, 90% of snaps. Maybe he's playing like 50, 60% even when he comes back, and that's just not enough. And so when you think about it, the most likely outcome could be that you're just like slightly disappointed. And when you're like, okay, that's fine if he's giving me the upside, right? Because if the average outcome is you're slightly disappointed, but the upside is wide receiver 1, you'll take it. But that's not the upside because he'd need a ton of injuries to really finish as a 1. And so if his ceiling is a 2 and you're taking him as like a low-end 3, I don't know. I think there's just a little bit too much risk where he's going right now to where I'm just not going to target him. So I'm cool that he keeps rising. Hopefully he keeps rising even further and people take him earlier and earlier. But I don't think we should be part of that group. The next biggest riser is Will Fuller, and I think that makes for a fantastic segue. Fuller is also a very risky pick, and he's going one spot before Deebo as a wide receiver 34. But I have him as a wide receiver 33, and I do have him as a target because of the upside. Remember, I just said if Deebo hits, then he's probably a low end 2, mid low end 2 if he hits. This is like upside. But if Fuller hits, he's like a mid-range wide receiver 1. I mean, that's not an exaggeration. That's his upside. He probably only hits it like 10% of the time, but it's in his range of outcomes. And he can absolutely be a wide receiver 1. So I don't want to go too in-depth on Fuller because I actually have him featured in a video that comes out later this week. But the rise is justified because even though he's just as risky, I actually have him as less risky than Deebo is because of the significant chance that Deebo does have another injury and he's already hurt, that adds to your injury risk. But even though they're both very risky, the upside you capture with Fuller is so much greater than you do with Deebo that I significantly lean his way. And since they're being drafted at the exact same spot, I'm going to take Fuller every single time. Another riser is DK Metcalf. He's up to the wide receiver 22, mid-5th round, which is almost exactly where I have him ranked. I don't believe there's any news that caused this rise. I think this is just people looking at the situation and seeing that he has been kind of undervalued. If you watched my video breaking him, McLaurin, and Chark down maybe like 2 weeks ago, then you know that I do agree with this rise. I think he was being a little bit undervalued. I still think he's a really nice pick. Still have him as a target, even at the wide receiver 22. Also because he goes in the middle rounds. This is the range where we target running backs really heavily in rounds like 1 through 4. Well, when you get to the mid-5th, you're looking wide receiver, and you're looking for a wide receiver that has a ton of upside. And no one's going to deny that, DK Metcalf could legitimately score 12 to 14 touchdowns. That's probably on the high end, but he could score double-digit touchdowns for sure. And he does have yardage upside because he's obviously a deep threat. So I think he's a phenomenal pick. If you watch the video, I do prefer Terry McLaurin. But hey, try and get both of them. Try and get all 3 of McLaurin, Chark, and Metcalf. But it is really nice that we're not going to preseason. That's one thing I'd be scared about. If you were really on DK Metcalf, he's a physical freak, right? And so if he goes out and he catches like 2 40-yard touchdowns in the preseason, his ADP is going up into like the early 4th round. Well, that can't happen. We could obviously get clips, from training camp and stuff, but it's much less likely, and far fewer people will see that than they would have if he just went off in the preseason. So a little bit, I guess, one nice thing for not having preseason is you can't get too much hype on players. Justin Jefferson, his rise is almost certainly from the comments that Gary Kubiak made recently. Kubiak, of course, the offensive coordinator for the Vikings. He said basically that Jefferson is exactly what they drafted. When they're looking at him in camp, this is the guy they wanted when they took him 22nd overall. And of course, they got that 22nd pick by trading away Stephon Diggs. They want him to fill that role. That's what they want, and it seems like he's going to do it. Now, I want to pump the brakes a little bit. You're going to hear a lot of people say he's going to fill the Diggs role. That does not mean Justin Jefferson is Stephon Diggs. There is basically no chance in the world that this season, at least this year, in the future it could be, this year, Justin Jefferson will not be as good as Stephon Diggs is. Stephon Diggs is a fantastic wide receiver, a fantastic route runner. He is better than Justin Jefferson. In 3 years, I don't know. Maybe just Jefferson gets really good. But this season, do not expect him to produce like Stephon Diggs. With that being said, he is still probably going to be a full-time player, maybe not week 1, week 2. But hey, you're not drafting him to start right away. So I believe within the first month, he will turn into a full-time player. He will get a ton of work in the slot. And while the Vikings are not a high-volume passing offense, they did still rank 23rd in completions per game last season. So while the volume is low, Cousins completes a lot of the passes. So 23rd in completions per game, that's not dreadful. So I do think the rise is justified. He's going as a wide receiver 51 on average, and that's like the late 12th kind of round. And he's my wide receiver 49. So I think he could still rise a few more spots. Not a huge difference, but I think he's a good pick if you're looking wide receiver in that range. Another riser is Christian Kirk, coming off the board as a wide receiver 40, and that's like the late 9th to early 10th round kind of range. I think this comes from comments that Kyler Murray made. So if you remember, Kyler Murray said that Hopkins, Kirk, and Fitz could all have 1,000 yards this season. That obviously, like, he's not just saying this is going to happen, but what you get, from him saying that is that he thinks that they're going to spread the ball around a lot. And that's what we've been expecting, right? We know this offense doesn't want to just give Hopkins a 45% market share and just every play be peppering him. They want to spread the ball around because that's how the offense works. So when you look at that, yeah, this is obviously a positive for Kirk. There was a concern that Hopkins comes in and just dominates the targets. One thing I want to say is Hopkins is really good. And I know that's like a ridiculous thing to say, like, obviously, right? But like, Hopkins is still going to be the guy. I still do expect him to have the largest share. So it's not going to be like Hopkins, Kirk, and Fitz all have like the exact same yards every single week. They're not all going to have exactly 1,000. I do think that the very, very, very likely outcome is that Hopkins is still the significant target leader, but just not like he was on the Texans, right? Because on the Texans, it was just like Hopkins up here and everyone else was lower. I think it's much, much closer than that, but you still got to realize that Kirk, it's not 1A, 1B. It's still 1 for Hopkins, 2 for Kirk. With that being said, I still do think that Kirk is a fine pick. He's not someone that I'm like aggressively targeting because, again, I do think that Hopkins has the biggest share. I think they run the ball a lot. I think they throw the ball a lot to running backs. So at the end of the day, Kirk's weekly ceiling isn't crazy high, but going as roughly like the wide receiver 40, I mean, that's fine. That's completely fine to me. If you want someone who is definitely not going to bust, but not going to finish on the high end. Like, you just want someone who you feel comfortable with, you have injuries, you have bye weeks, throwing into the flex, I think Kirk is your guy. But do not overreact. That's, I think, the biggest takeaway from this breakdown here is don't overreact to the 1,000-yard comment. He's just saying they're going to spread the ball around. He's not saying they're all going to have the exact same share. Let's move on to some fallers, though. Only have, I believe, 3 names here because, I don't know, if you guys dropped like one spot, and that's not very exciting to talk about. But the biggest faller is Hunter Renfrow, and we definitely expected this to happen. This comes after the comments that Ruggs is going to play a lot in the slot. You look at that and you say, well, Hunter Renfrow can only play in the slot, and so for every snap that Ruggs is there, Renfrow's on the bench. Like, they're not shifting Renfrow out to play wide. That would make absolutely no sense. He can't do that. So it obviously hurts his weekly floor and his weekly ceiling. I don't really think any of you were targeting Renfrow, so this is probably largely irrelevant. But I did see in some places people liked him as kind of a trendy flyer. I think you just avoid Hunter Renfrow. Bryan Edwards is better. Ruggs is definitely better than Renfrow is. They still have Darren Waller, obviously. They still have Josh Jacobs getting a ton of touches. They still have Tyrell Williams in the mix. So it's not like this is a team where Renfrow is different from like Allen Lazard. Like, Renfrow is probably a better wide receiver than Allen Lazard. You look at Lazard and you're like, well, who else are they going to throw to, right? That's not the situation for the Raiders. Like, they have people to throw to, so that you can't just look at Renfrow and say, well, they got to throw to someone. No, they've got Bryan Edwards, Ruggs, Tyrell Williams, Josh Jacobs, Darren Waller. Like, I mean, you put Renfrow basically after all of them. I don't know. I don't see the upside, and I want upside in my flyers. Michael Gallup is next, and I think this has more to do not with a specific comment, but people are looking at Lamb and they're like, okay, he's really good, right? Like, everyone thinks Lamb is going to be a fantastic wide receiver, and it seems like he's going to transition really well. Every comment seems to indicate that whenever they go to 3 wide receivers, he's absolutely going to be on the field. He's going to be being used, in the return game. Like, they love Lamb. They're going to play Lamb. And so people look at that and they say, Well, we know Amari's the one, and Lamb's going to get a ton, so I guess we should drop Gallup. I don't think that's the correct move. Honestly, I just think if you're leaving a draft and you don't have a player on Dallas, I feel like you did it wrong. I mean, if you can't get Zeke unless you have like a top 4 pick, but if you don't get Zeke, you have a chance to get Amari, and maybe you're someone who's like, he's too up and down, I don't want him. Well, then you have a chance to get Dak. You could say, okay, I don't want quarterback early. Well, now you have a chance in the middle rounds where we target wide receivers to take Gallup, and then if you miss out on him, you've got Lamb in the later rounds. So you just have so many opportunities at every single portion of the draft, and this is a team that is probably going to rival Kansas City for the most points per game. I truly believe this offense is just going off this season. And so take a piece, because someone's going to get lucky with touchdowns, right? If there's all these touchdowns that are going to get scored, someone is going to have a ceiling season. So I think you got to get a piece of this offense. And given, like I kind of said, some people think Amari's too up and down. Some people don't want to take Dak early. They want to take quarterbacks late. So it seems like the easiest players to get are Gallup and Lamb. And when you look at last season, Gallup was 6th in receiving yards per game. So I understand that Lamb is there, but he was 6th, and he's going as the wide receiver 30. And they still have 166 vacated targets from only Cobb and Witten, 190 in total, which is the second most of any team. So I would get it if they had 10 available targets from last season, and then you bring in Lamb. You're like, oh, well, they need to take a ton of work from everyone. They have 190 available targets. Lamb is not going to get that. So they have extra targets to just throw around. I don't see why you need to drop Gallup if you like Lamb. You can love both of them. I'm not sure I'd draft both of them, but again, I would try and get one of these dudes on my team. Final player we're going to go over today is DeVante Parker, and I'm not entirely sure why this one happened, to be completely honest. He didn't drop too much, so maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just other players kind of rising and him, I don't know, just being part of the mix, being like, oh, I like some people after him. Maybe they'll slide ahead. But I don't know. I don't think there's been any big news of why people should back off of him. I do think he's going in the right spot. So he's coming off the board as a wide receiver 27, my wide receiver 26th. That's like roughly the 6th round. And I think that's a good spot. I think if he was ever going in the 7th round, that's ridiculous, right? I mean, he was just incredible to close last season. The 5th round, because there's a lot of wide receivers I really like still available in the 5th round. But in the 6th, I think that is extremely fair. We do know that Preston Williams was performing better than him before tearing the ACL last season, but we do need to consider the fact that he tore his ACL. At the end of the day, that's a major knee injury. We cannot be sure that he's going to produce like he did to start last season. And if you look at success rates and you look at how good he was on routes, it's not like Preston Williams was dominating. It would be different if he was some, 1st or 2nd round pick that came out really strong, was really successful in these routes. That's not the case. He was not taken in the draft at all. He was undrafted. He was not overly successful on a bunch of different routes. He was just a good football player, and he was scoring points in fantasy. But Parker dominated to close the season. So I really don't think we should be super concerned about Preston Williams, especially since they're not even sure he's going to start the season. So I think he's just a good pick. Again, as long as he's going in the 6th round, he is a guy that I am very comfortable getting on my team. But if he fluctuates any earlier than that, don't love it. Later than that, really a guy I would go after. So those are the wide receivers who have been rising and falling the most in ADP over the last week. I went over running backs about a week ago, so check that out if you have not done so already. And remember to check out our website if you want to see a ton more information on every player. It's thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But that's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting that like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? Thanks for watching.